Right. We ready to roll? We've got folks joining in from all over for a wonderful session with Professor Jeanine Turner. Welcome to everybody online. I think it's fitting and ironic that we come together today by Zoom to chat with Jeanine about her new book, Being Present, while we are here online by Zoom. Jeanine's been an amazing friend and colleague of mine for more than a decade now, but she's been a true gem in the crown of Georgetown for more than 25 years. And it's a testament to her as a person and as a consummate teacher, educator, that there are many people here in the webinar who had her as a professor in master's and executive degree programs going back to 1996, and some alums who predate that, but must have crossed paths with you, Jeanine, along the way. So I know that many of you are familiar with Jeanine and are fans and are excited to hear from her and engage with her today. I'm going to kick us off with some initial questions, and then I'm going to turn pretty quickly to questions that you and the audience submitted in advance or that you submit using chat as we go. So feel free to, if Jeanine says something that prompts a question in your mind, please add it to chat. Anytime during the hour. We may not get to all of them, but Jeanine has asked to see all of them, whether we get to them or not. And so please do use chat and submit those. At the end of the hour, we have a discount code that we'll share so that you can get your own copy of Jeanine's book. And I also invite you to reach out if you're interested in designing a custom program for your organization with Jeanine and her work as a centerpiece to that. So that's all I have to say by way of preamble. Are you ready to dive in, Jeanine? We got lots of questions, a lot of ground to cover.
Right, thanks.
Awesome. So why don't we just start with a little bit of background. This issue of presence and attention at work and at home, importantly, couldn't be more timely, right? I mean, it's just amazing to think that this book came out at the time that it did. But you've been thinking about these issues for a long time. You probably have talked about these issues with many of the people who are in the webinar, attending the webinar today. When and how did you first start thinking about these issues, and how did finishing the book during the pandemic affect how you thought about them?
Well, thanks so much, Mike, for just starting us off. And really, I just want to say thanks to all the people that are here on the webinar. I had the opportunity to see so many of your names in the registration list, and I'm just so touched that you're spending the next hour here with me. So, and thank you so much. I could have never thought of these ideas and written about this book without the people on this call and other people that have been a part of my classes. So thank you so much. So really, I would say I've started thinking about this back in 2000, because at that time I was doing some research at America Online with some of my colleagues at Georgetown, and we were interested in this idea of instant messaging. How can people be on their computer with one instant message in a call, or an instant message comes up, or a couple? How do they manage multiple kind of conversations at once? And I even remember it was 2000 because my son Michael, who's now 22, was in the in like one of those jumper seats, and I was trying to kind of keep him excited while I'm on the, engaged while I'm on the phone with a colleague talking about this research. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. And so I think I've just been following it since then. And as I've been in classes, executives in my degree programs or in the custom exec programs and the graduate school, people would talk about how frustrating it was to be trying to be in a conversation and someone's on their phone, or be presenting and someone else is, on their phone. So we constantly were kind of really talking about those strategies. And then when it got to the pandemic, over the last year, of course, I have been thinking about this and trying to get this work out. And we developed a framework. And actually my colleague Sonia Fawcett and I had worked on this framework for a long time, and I wanted to get a book out. But, for those of you that are working moms, things take so much longer than you thought they would take. And I would have liked to have had it out prior to the pandemic, but it just, it didn't happen. And the pandemic so changed the way I thought about it. Not in a way that these ideas didn't make sense in the same way, but rather more that it exacerbated all of these different ideas. And it made people even more aware of just how challenging it is to be present. So I was fortunate in many ways to be able to incorporate many of these ideas into examples from the pandemic.
So Jeanine, you mentioned AOL and you mentioned students, and I know that talking to many of our masters and executive students along the way played a critical role in the evolution of your thinking about these topics. Are there other people or groups of people or organizations that you tapped to in conversation and interviews to help develop your thinking on these issues?
So really, it's really interesting that you say that because it's always top of mind. So I worked with some organizations. AARP has been a really strong supporter of this research. America Online was a strong supporter of the research, and the executive degree programs and custom exec programs. Each time I worked with executives, I would do a lot of interviewing with them. I also did some planned interviewing with some other organizations related to this. And then anytime I had the opportunity to work with students, I would try to get them out talking with their colleagues about what it is that they did when they were in multiple conversations at once, what strategies they used, and thinking about presence. So I have probably thousands of interviews associated just with this, and it's ongoing because I ask people all the time. And what's great about this topic is a lot of times you might be doing research about a topic and nobody really cares about it, so you're trying to get them excited about it. I have never found someone not willing to talk about this or to say, what do you think about it when people are kind of on the phone while you're also trying to present, and immediately people have a story or kind of an experience about it. So it's been really, really, really fun to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the framework, and then I thought maybe we could drill down into some of the elements of the framework and some of your, honestly, some of your advice for all of us to figure our way through these crazy times and through the challenges to attention and presence that we all face. So you organize the book in terms of 4 different kinds of social presence. You talk about budgeted presence, about entitled presence, competitive presence, and invitational presence. Can you just say a little bit about how you came up with those 4, and then maybe we can drill down on budgeted and talk a little bit about that one to start?
Sure. So initially, as I was thinking, when I go back to that time in 2000, when I was trying to think about how can people be present in these different places, I started making a list of all the different types of presence I thought I was observing. And then as I talked to people, I would try to catalog what they would say about types of presence. And in doing that, it really came down to these 4 different ways that you could be present as a communicator. And the way I think about it is every conversation is constantly, we're going back and forth between what I'm saying and then what you're saying. So we're constantly going back and forth. So really, it was just taking a snapshot as a communicator, and I'm trying to think about advice. What are the 4 choices you really have available to you anytime you're in a conversation and you're dealing with the fact that you have to address this digital device or this ubiquitous device that not only you are carrying, but everyone else is carrying too.
And let's start with budgeted. It's a business school, so budgets are something that people are familiar with, right? What made you think of this idea of budgeted presence? What is it? Are we over budget or under budget? What's this all about?
Sure. So budgeted presence comes from this idea of multi-communicating. So you and I, Michael, have talked a lot about multitasking, and we've both talked about, and many people on the call recognize that even though we all think we can multitask cognitively, the research says we actually can't multitask. And most of that research was done doing very simple tasks. And can people do both of these at the same time? And most people can't. I see communication as a much more complicated task than just maybe being on your laptop while you're also considering some other task at the same time. You're managing the personality, you're managing the role, your history, your values, all of this connection with the other person. And then you're doing that with a second person if you have 2 conversations going on at once. And so really, as I started doing this research on multi-communicating, that fed into these 4 types of presence. And so budgeted presence is when you're trying to engage in more than one conversation at the same time. So you're allocating part of your presence to one person, part to someone else. Right now, I am not in budgeted presence because I'm totally focused on you and this call. But my guess is that many people on this call are potentially listening to the call or paying attention to this call while they're also maybe texting or checking their email, something like that. So that's really essentially budgeted presence. The reason why I call it is because I want us to remember that you are, in a sense, allocating your attention to different people at one time, and you're treating the people that you're with like an expenditure. You're worth 80% of my time, you're worth 10% of my time. And I think that that's an important name for us to keep in the back of our mind, because we have to be in that presence most of the time. It's our default state. But when we're managing a relationship, we have to recognize that's potentially how you're treating that person. Almost like, I remember when I first came to DC, and you'd go to a cocktail party and you have a name tag on, and everyone has their name tag on. But I knew that I'd be talking to someone at the cocktail party, and they'd look at my name tag and they're like, oh, I don't know, she's worth talking to. And I could see them scanning around for someone else to talk to. And it's just so frustrating. And I think that's very similar sometimes to what budgeted presence can be.
So I hope that everybody on this webinar is allocating all of their budget to listening to you.
100%. Yeah.
But I know, we deal with our students, we deal with our colleagues, we deal with our family members, and the last 2 years or so have been an incredible source of pressure and stress on all of our attentional budgets.
Right.
What's your sense about, has working on Zoom, going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, given us less to allocate, or has it enabled us to do more? Or how do you see the last couple of years and strings of Zoom or Microsoft Teams or other meetings affecting our budgets and how we allocate our presence or attention?
If anything, I think it has made us feel even more comfortable with being in multiple conversations at once, almost expecting it. I was actually had an interview with one former student that was talking about how frustrated she was when people will be on a call and look like they're paying really close attention on the call with a high level person or something like that. And she said it just makes everybody else look bad, because everybody knows that everybody is on their emails, managing their task, and you can't really even get your job done unless you are on Zoom and also doing or video and also doing these other things at once. So this normative kind of understanding that I have to be doing that. And not only did that happen, that happened at work, it's also happened in our home life, because as work invaded many of our homes, we were constantly walking around with our phones or digital devices. And there was this expectation with, oh, I'm at work and at home at the same time. And the reason why I think it's so important for us to really be intentional now is that it's a little bit of I don't know if you want to think of it, a Faustian bargain. If you think about we're trading off flexibility, which we're so excited about having all this flexibility. We can work anytime, any place, anywhere, with connection, because we can't be really connected with multiple people at one time. And it gives us this sense that we can be in all these different places. So for example, if you think about a person that's thinking now, with hybrid work, now I can be at I can go to a soccer game, a child's soccer game. So then you're at the soccer game with your phone, you're on the phone with work at the soccer game. Every time your child looks up, they see you on the phone instead of seeing them, make their big goal or something. And so I think it's important for us to be intentional that sometimes we just can't be in multiple places like that. And it can be very frustrating. One other thing I want to say about that is, as a working mom, I often thought, frustrated that I was not at home more often for my kids. And I thought, I often thought it would be how much more quality time I would have with my kids as a stay-at-home mom. And I was interviewing this one mom that was talking about the phone and kind of this idea of budgeted presence. And she said, yeah, my 3-year-old the other day just grabbed my phone and just threw it against the wall. And it was this idea of, the way she was talking about it, it made me think about, because of our phones, because of this idea of acceptability around budgeted presence, everybody is a working mom. Because to a 3-year-old, people can't tell if you're texting someone else, or you're texting a friend, or you're, texting work. And so it's this sense of distraction to all of our relationships has become universal. And I think something we have to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think those examples hit home, certainly for me, and I'm sure for many of the people on the call. You talk about 4 kinds of presence, budgeted being one. Another one is competitive presence, and I wonder if you could say more about that. I think many of the people on the webinar today might remember doing an exercise with you, if they've had the the honor to be in your class about two people speaking at once. Is that what competitive presence is all about?
So that's actually one of my favorite exercises that I often get a chance to do with students. And it's basically, I have a student come up and give a presentation to the room. And then I have another student that comes up right next to them and they, give a presentation to the room. And then I ask those two students to give that exact same presentation at the same time. And they look at me like, oh, that's crazy. But what I'm able to show is when they are competing with someone else for the audience, it changes the nature of how they think about their content. They recognize they have to keep the attention of the audience because the audience is distracted by this other person next to them. And ironically, that is kind of really what made me think about this idea of competitive presence, because while at the end of the exercise, people say, well, we don't normally have someone standing right next to us giving a presentation in direct competition to us at the same time. And I would argue, no, you actually always have that. You don't have the same person next to you, but every single person you're talking to has a digital device that's pulling them away from listening to you. And you have to figure out how can you compete with that device. And it's about how do I think about being relevant, and not relevant to me, like, wow, this is really important, everybody has to hear this, but what's relevant to that audience? Because if you are not relevant to your audience, they have something in their hand in the form of a phone that they can find, that they'll find something relevant. And that's what's, I think, so challenging, which is why thinking about competitive presence, that you're constantly competing, is an important thing to think about.
Do you see competitive presence or budgeted or entitled or invitational? Do you see any of these as being more or less relevant at home or at work, or are they all really applicable in both, just in slightly different ways?
So I see them all applicable. It's just in slightly different ways. And so initially, when I was writing about the book, I had these home examples and work examples kind of twisted in the same area, and it got a little bit confusing because the way we think about how we interact at home is not necessarily always the way we think about work. I think some of the challenges at work is that you have all these deadlines and people that you feel like you have to connect with. And then at home, some of the challenge is you think you have time to communicate with these people, but actually you might not. And so there's some different stressors and different kind of incentives, but they both have challenges. And so then Georgetown Press, which has been an incredible team to work with, they suggested why not try two chapters, like a chapter for work and a chapter for home. And at first I thought that might be redundant, but it was actually really, really helpful to organize it. And I think it helps people to really get into the mindset of how each one of those has an impact.
Is there, I don't mean to put you too much on the spot, but is there sort of one thing that you think may work well in the workplace that we would all be well served by trying to borrow and use at home, or the other way around? Is there something that seems to work when we're budgeting or competing for our kids or our partner's attention that actually works at the office too?
Absolutely. So the main kind of goal of the book, and really the strategy, what I want people to think about, is to be intentional. And that's what I think we aren't. And it's easy for us to not be intentional because we are constantly reacting to this device. And I don't think that it's realistic to put the phone away, because of so many ways that have become integrated, so many parts of our lives that have been integrated into that device. However, it's also created this situation where we aren't as intentional as we could be. So what I think it's really important in every situation is to think, what is the context? Where am I? Who's my audience? What are they interested in? And what am I trying to share with them? So what's context, audience, and then what's the message? What message am I trying to share? What do I need to think about? And I think that I'm not saying I'm great at that at all. If anything, I wrote this book to help myself because I feel like it's so hard. But so many times, retrospectively, I've found myself and thought, what am I doing? Example that just hits in my head that I think about is because a lot of times we're in budgeted presence, not necessarily because we have a million things going on and we are trying to manage them all at once, but because we feel like the conversation's awkward or we don't know what to say. And we can turn to the phone, and then that gives us something to look at as opposed to engage in the silence or the awkwardness. And I remember I have two sisters. My sister Nicolette, we were actually in an emergency room. She was being treated for cancer, and my other sister Michelle is there, and the three of us are all looking at our phones. And I remember checking our phone for something, and I was thinking, what is wrong with this? And so much of it was because it was so hard to be dealing with this situation. But here we went to our phones instead of thinking, here is our opportunity to share with the three of us. And I think it's because it was so hard. So I think thinking about the context, thinking about the relationship that you have, the audience, and thinking about the message, that's something that you can have in the back of your mind. And even retrospectively, as you're thinking, wow, am I doing the right thing? What's the context message relationship? I think it can be helpful.
Well, so as I said, there were a ton of questions that came in advance from our audience, and then we got some coming in as we talk today. And I know Stephanie's been monitoring those new questions in the chat. So why don't we turn to some of those? There were a whole bunch of questions that had to do essentially with FaceTime. And FaceTime's not a new issue, right? FaceTime was an issue when we were all in the office on a more regular basis, but it's taken on a very different flavor, especially over the last couple of years. And so one of the folks in the audience asked, how do you get FaceTime with anyone when everybody's working from home and everybody's enjoying the flexibility that home-based work can afford, right? It's not all wonderful, but how do you get more FaceTime when everybody wants less Zoom time?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's really important not to necessarily equate Zoom time without being FaceTime, because sometimes you can have a very close, intimate conversation with someone over a video, depending on the situation. If it's, one-on-one, if you have a smaller amount of people. Because I think a lot of times people are saying we have to get back to the office for real FaceTime. And in some ways that might be challenging. For example, if you and I are trying to get back to the office for FaceTime, but someone else has to connect from, say, Wisconsin Avenue, and so that now they have to drive in, that has an impact. So I think what we have to think about is when we're saying FaceTime, it's how can we get back to having connection time with each other? And what do we need to do for that? And it goes back to, it has never been more important to really think about relevance for that audience. Because if people were, I've seen that change over time. Initially, I saw people pretending to pay attention in my classes, right? So they were really good at pretending to pay attention. And then over time, as people—
I don't think anybody here believes that, but we'll let you go with it nonetheless.
And then over time, people would be good at looking at their phone and making me think I didn't see it, right? Because they were just like quickly glancing. But then, people were just like, wow, I am on my phone because I need to be doing these other things at once. And so more and more, this idea of being totally connected, we feel like we don't have time for that. So that was prior to the pandemic. And now, as even I think of myself, when you're driving in, for those of you that are in DC or a place that has a logistic nightmare, you're just going to be driving in the whole way thinking, why am I going in? How is this benefiting me? And your bar for what constitutes effective FaceTime or in-person or this kind of intimate time has gotten higher and higher, the more logistics are associated with being able to make that happen. So then it goes back to, how can I be really intentional about when I need that? And it's not about my needs, it really has to be about your audience needs. So what is it about my problem that I'm trying to solve is also this audience member's problem? And then if they see it relevant, they're going to want to be a part of a conversation. And that's actually no different than work than it is at home, unfortunately. I feel like we used to have this kind of norm of everyone sits around the table and we had this time to get together. And then there was phones. You say, oh, no phones at the table. But just saying no phones at the table doesn't guarantee this incredibly thoughtful, rich conversation among your family. You have to think about, how do I create an environment where people feel comfortable being a part of this conversation and feel comfortable sharing?
So some of the examples you were just giving, especially in work contexts, had to do with being really intentional about kind of the give and the get and the task at hand and how to make good use of people's time. I wonder what your sense is, though, of the some of the more subjective value that comes from just visiting with each other in a way that isn't necessarily task driven. Like, how do we think about that kind of time in an environment where everybody feels so stretched?
Mhm. I think that's really a great point, and that's why people are so thinking that they need to get back in the office. So you have these impromptu kind of conversations or this opportunity to kind of get to know a person in a different way. And that really brings in this idea of invitational presence, which was kind of this fourth type, which is how do we create environments that allow everyone to share and get to know each other? And that requires trust building and relationship building. And that doesn't happen quickly, which is why I think sometimes people have this idea of we can get back to the office and that's going to come back. The challenge is we never fostered that necessarily in the office. It happened by happenstance because we all happened to be in the office at the same time. And so our organizations and our culture really didn't do a lot to foster this relationship building because it just happened as you walked into a meeting or happened as you walked into the building. And so now it's no longer just that's the way it is that we're all in the office together. Now we have to think about people's schedules and who's going to be in at the same time. And so we have lost the ability of this idea of it just happens by the fact that we're all together. Universities, we have to think about that. Student life happened so much because people were in these beautiful buildings or around this beautiful campus, and they would just all come together. And just the introduction of the phone has changed the way people are present in student life. And so, but now after the pandemic, we have to really think about how do we create a university that supports relationship building and trust building and opportunities for people to share. And I think it's something that we really have to be having conversations about, explicit conversations about, because this is kind of a new world we're entering where there's a lot of more choices on the part of your audience about where they're going to be.
So have you talked to any organizations that have started to come up with, or even just individual people that have started to come up with creative approaches to doing that? Are you seeing any glimmers of hope and creativity on the radar?
I think what's been the kind of the biggest creative or biggest opportunity is that people are actually seeing we have to get in our teams and talk about in an intentional way, how do we build relationships here? Because before you didn't have to do that. And so much of communication is seamless. We've not really seamless, but this idea that it's almost invisible. We've been communicating since we learned how to talk. So we have this idea that communication is kind of, oh, that's what we do. It's only when we have some disruption to the way we communicate, like the introduction of digital devices, like the introduction of the challenges associated with the pandemic, where we're like, wow, communication is not something that just happens. We have to be explicit and we have to be thoughtful about how do we talk about it so that we in teams have those conversations. So I feel like what's been great is teams and organizations are talking about how do we create an environment at work where people want to share information and build trust? How do we in our teams create norms for how we're going to communicate and engage? You teach about teams all the time and talk about the importance of norm and kind of building norms, but sometimes that gets skipped over as we get straight to task. What this opportunity now is giving all organizations and individuals and families and everybody is let's start to be thoughtful about how we're present, where we're present, and how do we create conditions for everyone to be thoughtful about what happens during that presence.
So one of the members of the audience asked a question about how does FaceTime and being present define an organization's culture? Are you seeing, or at the not just at the team level, but at the relational level, but at the whole organizational level, where these kinds of changes and how they approach FaceTime and presence is playing out at the organizational level?
So I think initially, and I've seen some different organizations have thought about what this means, and the challenge has been there's been this come back to work has been staged with all of these different variants. Some people are back, some people are not. But I think the extent to which an organization says everybody comes back and this is when it's going to be and that's it. There's a lot of pushback from that because before it was obvious, yes, that's where we worked, but now we've proven for 20 months that we can actually work from home. So it seems almost arbitrary. So you can't just, it kind of goes back to this idea of entitled presence. You can't just demand someone's social presence without trying to have a conversation about what that means, right? So I think some organizations have thought about this kind of top-down approach. Other organizations are saying, no, let's just let people decide. We'll make it completely flexible, and it's on the individual's approach, and they're going to decide when, so that we can have all this agency on the part of the audience. That's also challenging because now all of a sudden I've decided to come into the work, but now nobody else is there because everyone's connecting from home. And it's also now it's kind of a challenging time because the extent to which you're wearing masks makes it really not the same FaceTime or individual face experience. In some ways, I just taught the executive MBA leadership communication class last week, and the class started online, and then we had our first in person, and everybody had their masks on. It's such a weird disconnect because I'd seen their faces before, and now everybody's in the mask. So I think what's important for us to really think about and talk about what makes sense for a meeting, what makes sense for the organization, what makes sense for maybe a task or team, so that you can be thoughtful about it. And we never had to have those conversations before because it was just obvious. We were in the office, or there were a few people that were telecommuting, and that was just worked out. But now we're going to be more thoughtful. Even organizations that had people that were telecommuting before, I had so many stories where people said, I never realized how much I never paid attention to the person that was coming in from somewhere else. They'd even have lunches. Everybody's eating lunch while somebody else is watching everybody have this lunch meeting. So I think in so many ways, this is giving us an opportunity to think about what we're doing, be intentional about it, and bring everybody into the conversation. And that's, I think, the most creative approach. And it's setting norms and a sense of expectation as it relates to communication, which we often don't do.
So there was one other question that was about FaceTime and the questions that the audience submitted in advance. And I think it's one that probably lots of people have on their mind at various points in time. But do you have any suggestions or advice or tips for staying on the top of our colleagues' mind when we're working remotely? There is this real fear of out of sight, out of mind. And I think especially for new employees or junior employees, they worry about, like, does anybody even know I'm here? How do we, any suggestions or advice for those for whom that's an issue?
Oh, absolutely. I think just the very fact that people are thinking about it, very important, number one. Number two is, if you're on a call, really think about what it means, what that call is about, and make sure you have your video on if you can. I mean, so many people have thought, oh, now I don't have my video on, I could do all these other things. You're trading out an opportunity for someone to see your face when you turn the video off. And what's been challenging, as I've talked to many different people about this, many women, even when you think about K through 12, many girls that didn't feel like they were Instagram ready would turn their cameras off, or women have different perspectives about what they need to be looking like when they're on camera. And in many ways, taking themselves out of the conversation by turning the camera off. So I think you have to think about, what does that mean? I think in terms of being present in chats, if you have that going on in your Zoom meeting, that shows that you're present. And I think that you have to also think about, what are my goals for the week, and how am I achieving those goals? And maybe it's having a conversation with your the people that you're working with. What's the best way to communicate that? So maybe it's an email once a week. Just want to let you know, this is where I am. This is what I'm doing. Because it is very different to be a new person in an organization and people only seeing you online. They have to figure out a way. How can I make a list of the people I need to be present with? And what does that present going to look like this week? And maybe you can keep track of the messages you've sent with them, how often you've been on video with them, so that you're really thinking about it. In the same way, we often tell people to think about your network. Identify who your network is. How often have I connected with those people on my network, and how have I connected with them? And are there people on the network that I need to develop that I haven't been? Same thing now about presence. Think about the top 7 people that you need to be engaging with, and how have you been present with them with work, and what are some things you can do? It's very important to have that conversation, though. For example, Michael, if I'm emailing you every week, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing, and you're thinking, what's with these emails? That's just, I'm just going to be like a stalker getting on your nerves, as opposed to saying, hey, I really want you to know what's going on with me. What's my best way to keep present with you?
So actually, one of the questions that came in the chat just a moment ago was about the distinction between presence and mindfulness. Do you see those as related? They're not the same, I would imagine, in your opinion, but how are they connected?
Wow, that's such a great question. So I think when I think about being present, I'm thinking about how you're socially present with someone else. So how are you engaging in the conversation with someone else? What does your social presence look like? I think there's a lot of research on mindfulness that's thinking about being present is intrapersonal presence rather than interpersonal presence. Intrapersonal presence is more how am I feeling in the moment, but it necessarily adds to your social presence because being present in the moment is going to add to being present with this other person in this conversation. And I absolutely recognize that you do not have time all to be totally in the moment and present in the moment necessarily all day long because you're constantly getting these messages. So there's been a lot of research that says just turn off your phone, and I think it's unrealistic during this day and time. But if I'm in a conversation with you, I want to show you that I'm socially present with you. I might even say, I just want to let you know I might be getting a call during this meeting and I'm going to need to look at it. And I'm just letting you know about that, but I really care about this meeting. It's about being explicit about that presence and how important that is to you. And the book talks about strategies like that to help people think about how to be more explicit.
Another one of the questions that's come in from the audience has to do with the distinction between interactions like the ones that I think we've been focused on so far, which are more kind of presentation and direct interactions at work or at home. But can you say anything about whether these principles and kinds of presence apply to social media presence or to an audience that's sort of not right there with us? It's kind of a broader social audience.
Right. So I think you have to be just as intentional. I think we could all think of examples where people posted something quickly in a social media situation and did not think about who their audience was or how their audience is compartmentalized. And so for me, social presence is also how are you present in social media and how do you find your voice in that area? And I'm not as, I'll be the first one to say that's not like one of my expertise, right? So I don't feel as comfortable with my voice in posting in social media or in certain social media apps. Many of my students feel more present and more comfortable posting in those places than they might in a face-to-face meeting or in a text. So what's important for you to think about is in all of those situations is who's my audience and who am I trying to reach? What's my message for that audience? And that helps you to be thinking about how to be your best self in those situations. I think most of the mistakes that people run into is because they said something, not thinking about who that audience is. And what I think is challenging about social media is we have to keep in mind that more and more people are in that message stream that we are not always aware of and know us from different aspects of our life. And so what might seem funny or interesting or that everyone knows you're a joke in this context, this other wider group doesn't have. And so it's social media is taking mass media one way and making it interactive. And we've never had to deal with that as a society before, which is why we often have challenges and problems in that context.
So you talked about your own social media skills. One of the members of the audience asked about skills also, and he or she said, does a 50-year-old, somebody who's kind of mid-century modern, let's say, need different skills to connect with 20-year-olds, and maybe especially to connect with 20-year-olds if they're early 20-year-olds who've spent the first couple of years of their working life from an apartment, from a bedroom, from a couch. What are those of us who are closer to your age and my age than maybe a first-year undergraduate need to develop? Can we get away with not being good at some of these things, or are there some that we really need to have skills-wise?
So I think that's really such a great question. What I think has been really interesting is like sometimes I'll talk to the seniors at Georgetown and they'll talk about how the freshmen communicate in this new app. So I'm not up on that app, so I can't do that. Or my high school brother or sisters, they can do this, I can't do that. So it's what I think it's really important for us to think about is it's changing so fast. We think about these generational differences. Now we have these very, very quick changes in kind of the adaptation we have to certain communication platforms. But back to what your question was, just in terms of, can you be in these other places? I think you absolutely can. I don't think you can be, you really can't be good at all of them. So you have to almost kind of to pick and choose it. Where do I want to be present and how I'm going to be present in those places? And I definitely think, if anything, what these changes so quickly has shown that our ability to get to understanding is more challenging than ever before. And so our need to really have empathy and try to understand where someone is coming from, really, really important. And talking about kind of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to communicate. I think if you're saying, if you find yourself saying, well, they just have to understand this generation, or I've heard many different. So for example, an executive was talking to me about how they were in class. They were in class and they were talking about someone that was coming into their office and they were on their phone all the time. And it was just driving them crazy because this was a new entry level kind of person. And he was kind of really reaching out to them. He was a senior executive at this organization. And he said, he goes, it just drives me crazy. Every time that we were in a conversation, he's on his phone. And I said, well, did you say something? Did you say, your frustration or something? Did you talk about it? And he said, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to be that person. I want to be that old, he said, old fogey person. He doesn't want to be that person. He said, but I'll tell you, I'm never going to promote him. And so I think that's so telling. Here's a person that could have a complete this senior executive has a complete misunderstanding of potentially what's going on with this younger person, right? That is in the office texting. The person in the office might think this new person is texting, they might be texting and they're showing, look how busy, look how much I'm working for you. That's how hard I'm working. I mean, I'm doing all this work while I'm also in the conversation with you. See how busy I am. They might be trying to communicate how busy they are, not necessarily that they're making all these weekend plans. But because neither of them are talking about it, the misunderstanding, huge. And I use this example all the time in my classes, that if I could reach out and touch your shoulder and read your mind, I would never have a communication problem with you because I would understand where you're coming from. I might not agree with you, but I would never have a communication problem. Communication problems happen because what's in my head and what's in your head might not be the same thing. And the only way we can get to understanding is by being willing to share what our understanding is and trying to get the other person to share their understanding. So I guess two things. Number one, we need to have empathy because everybody doesn't have the same understanding of any of these different contexts and what they mean, number one. And number two, we need to be explicit about what our expectations are and not just assume that there's some norm that's been established. And if a person violates the norm, somehow they are, they're trying to, do this from negative intent, but rather to recognize that norms are changing constantly. And we have to think about being explicit to catch up with them.
So one of the audience members asked a question that's related here. They said that, excuse me, technology enables people to engage their audience with some of the new tools, polling and other kinds of things. And the member of the audience said that those tools seem kind of underutilized, maybe for developing understanding, maybe for getting a sense of where your audience or team or organization is. Have you looked at the effectiveness of any of those additional tools? Zoom and Teams and everybody's trying to compete to some extent by augmenting the basic features that they provide. Are they useful?
So I think they can be really useful. Some of the challenges with polling is that you necessarily have to plan what you want that question's going to be, and you have to be aware of it. And when we had these, when we did polling within the classroom, many people would recommend that if you want to really get this polling going, you want to have polling going almost like every 10 minutes, another poll, another poll. So that can be great, but then the challenge is now we have this whole great conversation going and it doesn't connect with that poll that I did 48 hours ago in preparation for this meeting. So I think what's challenging is almost coming up with the instant poll is hard. Now a way to deal, so I think polling can be great for engaging, but I think another tool that I think is something it could help is there's this chat that's ongoing chat within Zoom. I think reinforcing people to use the chat and thinking about how you can keep the chat going can help you have this kind of background sense of what people are talking about. And when if you don't have the chat, like even I'm back in face-to-face meetings with some of my classes, what I've thought about is creating a shared Google Doc that has an ongoing chat, essentially, that everybody has access to. So it brings some of that capability into the face-to-face in a way that might be helpful. I think this interactivity is what we're really trying to kind of generate and trying to create that dialogue. And so the ways that we can do that, we have multiple ways to think about doing that.
So one of the audience members today asked about things like chat and Slack and other things. You know, they make it very easy for us to go sidebar, to set up a side channel, to create small groups,
Yep.
threads. And this audience member wondered and maybe worried about, you know, is this actually making us more polarized, more divided, more subgrouped? Do you see that? And if you do, are there things that you think we could be doing to guard against that?
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful and thoughtful question, because I feel like we are all about efficiency, getting things done. And to the extent to which we are all about efficiency, we lose track that communication is not just about the task, it's also about the relationship. And the more we focus on efficiency and getting things done fast, the less we're building trust, the less we're building relationships. And so often the most efficient thing to do is for me to just pull you aside, Michael, and say, oh, let's just figure this out in this meeting, and then we'll bring it to everybody. But then necessarily that means there's these other people at the meeting, they know that we met outside, and then what does that mean for how we're gonna engage and communicate? One group that I was talking to, we were talking about communication challenges in the organization, and they tried to get Slack started. And they were, a few people were using Slack, all excited about Slack, but then there was these two people that were kind of more senior. They didn't want to use another app, but they actually would meet each other at the same kind of drop off for daycare. They just happened to be there. And so they would get all this conversation done, but it would leave people out. So in so many ways, our technologies often just replicate what has been going on for years, is that people tend to connect with people that they see that think the same way they do, and they feel most connected with. They tend to connect with those people, and they'll find ways to do that because that is the most efficient thing. So I think that question that person asked is so important, because in this time when we're trying to build environments with diversity, equity, inclusion, more supportive environments, those environments are important for us to build relationships, important for learning, important for curiosity, but often are not as efficient, because necessarily we're bringing together people that don't see the world the same way we do. And so I think prioritizing, and which many organizations are doing that now, prioritizing difference and prioritizing bringing different voices into a conversation is critical, because technology will allow you to quickly kind of bring in just the people that maybe already agree with you. We've also seen that with Zoom, where it's hard to have this big Zoom meeting, but I'm going to quickly call someone ahead of time that I can text. And so necessarily that's leaving so many people out of the conversation. So we have to really be thoughtful about that. So really great question.
So there's lots of great questions. So let's try to get through as many as we can in the 10 minutes that we have left. So another audience member asked about whether you can have a laid back, casual kind of family and friends style in a helpful way versus a more professional or controlled one, and how that might play into this whole idea of trying to create connection, right? There's a there's a tendency or a sense that, well, while we're remote, while we're in hybrid mode, maybe I should be more relaxed, more casual, you know, and many people are working from home, and it naturally comes with a little bit more kind of casual approach. But how do you see that balance between professional tone, professional speech, professional communication, and this slightly more casual approach playing out?
So I think so a couple things. So the one thing is, I know many people that I talked to over the course of the last 19 months in kind of lockdown situations would say that they got to know their professors in a way that they never did before. They got to know their CEO. So the empathy that kind of really developed because people had an insight into what other people's lives were like. And this was also what a traumatic time this last year and a half has been for so many people. And so I think that empathy that came into the workplace because of more of a casual approach, that you saw people in more of their backstage, I guess you would kind of talk about it, added that empathy. I think going back into the workplace, I'm hoping that we retain that empathy and this sense of understanding of where people are coming from, and this ability to kind of maybe share a little bit more of what your context is so that we can better understand each other. The second thing I would say is that in so many ways, this new way of working where we only had to worry about this much of our body has changed the way we are our social muscles. So we have kind of atrophied in that we don't have to, just walking into a building and thinking about how your whole body looks and then how you're interacting with people, or walking into a meeting and looking around. Even me walking in and teaching EMBA and everyone has their mask on, and me thinking about how I need to really think about being present here, and now think also about people that are on hybrid and how am I going to keep track of all of this at the same time, has created more challenges in terms of how we present ourselves. So I think that just like people will say, when you dress up for a job interview, you wouldn't wear your pajamas to a job interview, though many people I know talk about how they have their pajama pants on all the time. That I think the way you're dressed and how you feel very much communicates often, because it's so much of who you are. So it's important to think about how you're presenting yourself like that.
Well, I promise our audience that neither Jeanine nor I have our pajama pants on below the line. One of the audience members asked about, while multitasking and budgeted presence seem pretty clearly to have strong negative connotations, lots of organizations include the ability to multitask as a job characteristic or as a characteristic for hiring, right? We want people who are good multitaskers. Are we speaking out of both sides of our mouths when we do that? How does that play out?
So what I really want to reinforce, and I think it maybe seemed like we think maybe I'm somehow in my examples of budgeted presence that it's like a negative thing. It's absolutely not negative. We often have to. In fact, in many ways, our organizations are expecting it. I think that we have able to get a lot more done in many ways because people have been engaged in budgeted presence during Zoom calls, and they're not, in their mind, wasting time by listening to something that maybe is not relevant to what they're doing. So they're able to get all these things done. Then they come back in the workplace, and now they're in a face-to-face meeting, and they can't imagine sitting there and not doing all these other things at the same time. So I think we have to be careful that we've fostered budgeted as that's the way you're supposed to communicate. But I think what we have to remember is that while we might feel like we're effective at that, our mind works 4 to 5 times faster than we can speak. So while you're talking, I'm thinking of something else, or while you're talking, I'm texting someone else. And so while it seems like we can do it, in certain situations, we're going to lose out on information, or we're going to miss access to information. And sometimes it might be helpful. It doesn't even matter that we miss that information. Other times it's going to be really important. So I think you're right. Our ability to manage multiple things at once, more and more, there's this expectation. But second, recognize that because of that, we still have to manage relationships. And so being explicit and saying, we're going to have, maybe instead of having 45-minute long meetings or 50-minute meetings, we're having a 15-minute meeting. For 5 minutes of that meeting, we're going to have a dialogue, and I want us to have a lot of focus on that conversation and not be on multiple things at once. So more explicit conversation about what your expectations are in every conversation or meeting.
I think maybe we have time for 1 or 2 more. One of the questions that came in from the audience today has to do with introverts and the possibility that the last couple of years have actually been a good thing for people who are somewhat more introverted. And now, as people itch to get back together in the office, maybe it's going to be challenging. Do you see personality dimensions like extroversion and introversion playing a role in presence and how we think about the return to office, return to more face-to-face work?
Oh, absolutely. That's such a great question because actually my colleague Sonia and I are continuing to think about this framework. And initially we thought mostly context, message, and audience, but really the communicator is such a huge part of it, who you are and how you feel comfortable and how you think about your presence. And you're right, many people that have kind of see themselves as more introvert or conflict avoiders have said they have really enjoyed the agency that they have in this kind of more of a work from home situation where they can decide how a little bit more about how they're present and how they're going to engage. And so I definitely think that your style, your communication style has a huge impact on where you feel most comfortable, which is why even more important to be thinking about how we're explicit about how we approach conversations and how we approach the way what we find helpful. So for example, we talk about conflict a lot in our executive classes, and we talk about how avoiders often will have a hard time in a face-to-face meeting. They're never going to say what they really think. So if face-to-face you think, oh, what's everybody think? An avoider is never probably going to say, oh, I disagree. So they'll wait and hold back. So once again, as executives, as leaders, we have to think about what are the communication styles around the table. Maybe a face-to-face in-person meeting doesn't allow everybody to be the most present. Maybe we have to think about other ways, or maybe creating an agenda ahead of time to give people a chance to prepare. So I think that communication style and thinking about that will be huge as we go into conversations about how we're going to be at work, where we're going to be at work, and how we're going to be present in conversations.
So last one, we probably only have a minute for this one, so it's a sort of speed question, but one of our audience members wants to know if you have any advice in the book or briefly now for how we can try to keep focused on a task or on a conversation ourselves and hold off the urge to multitask. Any advice on how we all keep ourselves a little more focused?
Absolutely. So something that I'm really trying to be better at this too. So my family and friends that are listening is be intentional as you go into a conversation and recognize that your device is definitely going to be vibrating or making some type of a noise, whether it's a social media update, something, a text, and think about who are you with, and is that where do you want to allocate your presence at that time? So I guess what I'm thinking is the best advice looking into the future and even just thinking about your organizations is be intentional about my context, my relationship, and my audience so that I can be as thoughtful as I can in that conversation. And if it means I can't be completely connected with this other person at that time, be explicit about saying, here's some challenges I'm facing. I just want to let you know, but I really care about this conversation, or I care about this meeting, and I want us to and I'm excited to learn from you. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it's a great summary and a great way to wrap things up. You know, we're all lucky whenever we get a chance to learn from you. We're all lucky to get a sense from you about how to be more empathetic, how to be more intentional, how to be more explicit, how to be more understanding in our communications and our relationships. And these last 2 years have made those things all the more important. So it's wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to see your book. Oops, it's coming in and out of the virtual background there. It's wonderful to see your book in print. And I know that there's an eager audience to hear more from you about that. The book is available, Audible or in print. There's a discount code for anybody who's interested in saving 30% off. It's TGUE to get 30% off if you were here today. And for anybody else who's interested in learning more from Professor Turner, from Jeanine, we're also happy to talk about custom programs. She's been a stalwart and just a shining star in Georgetown's classroom for years. And so for anybody who's interested in engaging more with Jeanine and perhaps talking about how her ideas could be helpful for you and your organization, happy to do that as well. But most of all, we're just happy to have you here. Happy that you've given us the gift of these ideas now in a wonderful compilation, and look forward to reading and putting to good use all the great advice that you have. So thanks again, Jeanine. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, thanks all of you for being here. I really, I thank you so much for your presence today.
There you have it. Take care, all.